给我们来分享他的研究。
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Can you understand me? Yeah? Very good. So I've been learning Chinese for the last 4 weeks. But I must admit, I speak Chinese so little that I have to give my presentation in English. And I will try to speak a little bit more slowly so that those of you who don't know English that well can understand a little bit. So it's a great privilege for me to be here and be one of the keynote speakers. Here is what I'm going to do this morning with you. I will first give you a little bit of background. Why am I here and what am I trying to accomplish? Then I am going to give a little bit of an overview of case studies in the field of management over the last 20 years in the American context. Because, you know, the American journals are very important, and so having a sense of what is going on there is also useful. I will then make a small point that a case for teaching is very different than a case for research. I think you all know this, but oftentimes I'm getting a case for research, and I said, this is not a research case. So I want to make a little bit of a distinction. What are the key differences? And then I'll come to the major part of my talk. What is a compelling case? How do you persuade your audience, your reader, that with your case you have made a contribution to science and a contribution to the field of management? And to help us with this, I'm going to review 4 of my favorite case studies. If you can do a case study like this, you can get published in SMJ, ASQ, AMJ, no problem. And then I will offer you some concluding thoughts on cases. One of the main reasons why I'm here today is I've become a senior editor of Management Organization Review. You all know Management Organization Review, but what you may not all know is this. In 2011, when I joined, it had an impact factor of 2.4. It was number 29 out of 168 journals in management. And last year, look what happened. The journal is already at number 14, only 7 years old. And our goal is to take the journal even higher, that the deans of the business schools in China will say, you can get promoted here to a top position with a paper in Management Organization Review. So one of the reasons I'm here is because I want to encourage you to submit to the journal, and I also want to help you submit something that has a chance of getting through the process. I should also say to you, because you also may not know this, that the journal under the leadership of R. Lewin has a decentralized process. That means we have 25 senior editors. I'm one of them, and I have complete control over whether the article gets in or not. Which means you will pick a senior editor who is very close to what you're trying to write about in theory, and pick that senior editor, and your chances of getting in are higher. I now want to give you a little bit of an overview of the status of case study and qualitative research over the last 20 years. So I was a student at Columbia University. I started my PhD in 1991. It took me 6 years to do my PhD, because doing good work is not that easy. And I may be a bit slow. Here is what we were taught. Basically, we were taught 2 things, and that signal came out in every course, came out in private conversations. Good social science is when you have a study with a large N. Many cases, large cases, 100,000 data points, and you run a regression, and that's science. Because that's what they do in physics, and that's what they do in engineering. The second thing we were taught very clearly is you must have a regression analysis in your dissertation, otherwise you don't get a job, because that's what science is. Now, I thought then this was totally foolish, and I still think it's totally foolish. And if you're getting the same message from your doctoral programs, trust me, it is foolish. Because in order to make good science, you first have to understand the phenomenon. And you don't understand the phenomenon if you download a data set from the web, from the Statistical Office of China, run some regressions, and then construct hypotheses around this and say this is science. Now, to give you a Example, I took a different course. I found some advisors who were happy not to have a regression equation in my dissertation. And let me show you some data. So here I do regression analysis work as well, but look, here's Google Scholar site. This is hard data. My most successful publication has been a comparative historical case study of an industry, no regression equation. It has 680 sites. My best regression paper has 109 sites. Okay, so you can be very successful with qualitative case research if you do it well and if you are passionate about it. Now, the reason why my professors in my early days of graduate school gave me the advice of doing regression equation because they were actually very pragmatic. Look at this. So these are the 47 articles published in 1992. This is the year I entered graduate school. There was one qualitative article published that year in that journal. This means you had a 2% chance of getting in. So they were realistic, Peter. This is difficult. Think about it. Now here's the good news. You were born at a better time than me. This is, and I spent a couple of hours putting this data together just for you. Here are 74 research articles published in 2013, so this is the last year. I looked at every single article of AMJ. There are 14 qualitative small n articles published. That means it's a 19% share. So look at this. Over the last 20 years, the rate of small n qualitative studies at AMJ has gone 10 times. Now you have a significant chance of getting in. Before, even if your study was good, you almost had no chance of making it. Now let's speak a little bit about why did this happen? Why did suddenly the top journal of the Academy of Management publish more qualitative research by a factor of 10? And I think there are two reasons. One, after World War II, in American social sciences, there was a move towards mathematical analysis. You've seen it in economics. You've seen it in every single social science field, from sociology to psychology. Make it numbers, and then we will be more like engineering and physics. Herb Simon was also someone who believed, yes, you would have a more rigorous science if you go towards numbers. After 30 years of doing this, and really not making that much progress, the leading figures in the field, at least privately, started to lose confidence that only focusing on mathematical analysis is the way to go for the science. And here's a quote from Herb Simon that he himself had great confidence and he became himself disillusioned. Now, some of you who are more in the HR field, you may have come across another person I want to talk about. Secondly, and I felt this very strongly as a doctoral student, that people were doing these regression analyses not because they believed it was good science, but because that was the game that was being played. And a lot of people spent their careers doing this, and then they got to 40 and 50 and said, well, is this all I'm going to do with my career? And they themselves wanted to change. A good example of this is Jane Dutton. For you, those of you in HR, you know this. Jane Dutton came to my University of Northwestern in 1998. After her talk, we had a private conversation for 2 hours in a taxi cab, where she herself articulated to me, Peter, you're clearly doing something different. I'm not happy with the status quo of how we're going to do research in the field of management, and I want to change. I don't want to retire 20 years later on and feel like I've never done what I really wanted to do and make a real contribution to management, make a real contribution. And she founded in Michigan the Center for Positive Organization. If you go on the website, you can see our domains of research are positive leadership, meaning and purpose, ethic, virtues, relationship, and culture. So people like Jane Dutton, because she was such a high-profile person in the field, going around and saying what we are doing collectively as a field is not enough, had an impact encouraging other people to say perhaps we need to do more case studies and qualitative research in order to have a deeper impact. I'm going to give you another piece of evidence how much people in the US context have been craving to publish more case studies in quality research. You all know the famous 1998 site of Kathy Eisenhardt. That this is cited very highly is not surprising to anyone. But look, AMJ had two little editorials, one by Eisenhardt and a former student, Melissa Gribner. This is only 2007. 4,200 people cited a 6-year-old article talking about how to do case studies better. Then there's another article by Nikolai Sikulkov, who I will talk about in a moment, which had 1,300 citations. These are all articles that talk about how to do case studies better, and you can see the fact that people are citing it so much means people want to publish their own case studies, and they need to find a way to articulate why what they're doing is important. So there's a big craving to have more people do case studies in qualitative work. I myself ran between 2005 and 2008, very similar to this forum here. I ran a forum at the Academy of Management together with Diana Day. You can see the power of richness, quality research. This was a PDW at the Academy of Management. Every year we had at least 200 to 300 people, just like here, who came and wanted to listen to the leading figures in qualitative research. This is again an evidence how much demand on the part of individual researchers there is to do qualitative research case studies. The slides from these presentations are all still on the web. There are people like Carl Weick. I had the leading figures basically there, and I encourage you to go there and take a look. Now, another big reason why there are more qualitative in small N or case study research in AMJ is this. And this, I think, is very, very profound. The editors of AMJ since 2001 also realized we don't have enough quality research, and they promoted qualitative research in case studies. And this is very crucial. They appointed associate editors on the journals who could review it, and they did this for the last 10 or 20 years. So if I were to ask myself, it's not sufficient that you actually have people who want it. You need to have editors who are willing to promote and let these studies go through and help to promote these studies. So these are basically a long series of editors since 2002 in AMJ who have promoted qualitative research. This is why we had a tenfold increase in the number of submissions. Okay. So far, this is the good news. I still think 19% of articles in AMJ, or you can take any other top journal, based on qualitative research in small n is not sufficient. If you were to ask me, in order to make progress, initially we need to understand phenomena in detail. Later on, we can run regressions on large samples. That means if you ask me, at least 50% of all articles in the top journals should be based on qualitative case research. And that means we got to do something about it. We need to get the case studies that many of you have been submitting here more often published. We need to submit more case studies because it's a simple mathematical equation. If more large sample regression papers are submitted to the top journals, that means by definition, if it's a fair process, more large N studies will get published. So we need to increase the submission rate of good articles. And that is why I'm here. I'm trying to share with you some ideas. How are we going to create more compelling case studies that have a chance of getting into the top journals? I want to make a quick point how research case studies are very different from teaching cases. A case for teaching can simply illustrate a general principle of what has been already known before. In fact, the case is very good when the essence of a general phenomenon is being exemplified by the case. You can even write a completely fictitious case for teaching purposes. I have written a case on performance appraisal with Judy and Jack completely made up because it articulated very clearly the message that I wanted to convey. Writing a fictitious research case is not acceptable. And sometimes it's a little bit tricky to not let one's own interpretation go too far, and then the case becomes a bit fictitious. A research case study needs to develop some potentially new theoretical knowledge, and here I have a typo, or at least it needs to develop a new idea that was not previously articulated. If you're just saying, my case illustrates something that's been known before, you are never going to get published in a top journal. I want to talk about the article that I mentioned before. Nikolai Sikolkov, after he appeared at my PW, wrote an article for AMJ, Persuasion with Case Studies. If you have not read that article, I strongly encourage you to read this article. And in the article, he basically says, make sure you have a talking pig. And I tried to translate this for you into Chinese. I'm not sure if it's correct. What does he mean by that? He means, if you come to me and say, Peter, I have this fantastic case study of a company in Nanjing. They do X. And I say they do X is, they hire good people. Well, I know that hiring good people is a necessary requirement for being successful. If you told me, I know a company in Nanjing that on purpose hires the worst people, but they're the most successful company in Nanjing, I say, wow, that is really surprising. And if it's true, that is amazing. I want to know. And basically, Nikolai's point is, when you have this talking pig, meaning something that nobody has ever seen before, people are not going to ask you then say, oh yeah, you have one talking pig, but you don't have thousands, so it's not science. Or I don't want you to study this. Your audience will say, if you truly have a talking pig, I don't care about regression. Explain to me why there is a pig that's talking. I don't believe it. Similarly, the company in Nanjing that hires the worst people and is the best performing, if that is true, that is so amazing. You can make a huge contribution to our management understanding. So let me put this more generally. In order to write a compelling case study, it has to have at least one of the following features. Number one, readers would not expect it. It's counterintuitive. Number two, the existing theories say that this should not exist, or this theory simply cannot explain it. And number three, it sheds light on a phenomenon that no one has studied before. And typically that means is people may have studied it from a very distance, but nobody knows the microcausal processes of what actually is going on. That means with your case study, you are shedding light on a phenomenon that no one has seen in that detail before, and that means you can actually illuminate the situation and make a progress to the growth of knowledge. Now let me give you examples of all this. In high school, I was a student of biology. And I was quite surprised to learn that there are some creatures, like a lizard, if you cut off the tail, chop, within a couple of months, a new tail grows. This is a fact of biology. There are a couple of other species which can regrow some of their parts. I knew this, and then I came across this study. It seemed to me at the time a very counterintuitive case. This is called Carl Zeiss. For those of you who have been in science, you may have done science experiments with microscopes. Carl Zeiss was the first microscope company in the world, formed in 1846, I believe. And then what happened was World War II came about, and for those of you who know world history, Germany was divided into West Germany and East Germany. And what happened was, with the help of American military, the managers and engineers were taken from Carl Zeiss, which was in East Germany, and taken over, brought to West Germany. And the workers, because of course they were believed not so important, they remained in East Germany in Jena. And Bruce Kogut and Udo Zander wrote a piece, and I was a friendly review of the piece, and there was a small little footnote in there, which basically says, yes, the engineers and managers went over, and then their paper shows that this high-tech company, over the next 40 years, developed similar technological capabilities. And I say, what? I can understand engineers and managers that they can recreate the firm, that they can recreate the tail. But the workers, to recreate the technological knowledge of the engineers? Wow, that is, if true, a talking pig, right? Because it is so hard to believe. So I potentially had a counterintuitive study here. The only problem is, once we looked more closely, it didn't turn out to be entirely true. So a couple of years later, I was in Jena, a visiting scholar, and I dug into the archives of that company. So what really happened is, not all managers went to the West, and not all engineers went. Some stayed back in Jena. So they had some engineers left. So what seemed to be a talking pig counterintuitive was no longer that counterintuitive. And that meant that case study, which would have been a great case study, no longer is a good case study to learn about knowledge creation, knowledge recreation. But it turned out there was something else very fascinating about this company. And so we wrote something completely different about this company. It turns out, for those of you who study the resource-based theory of the firm, Edith Penrose, people have heard about Edith Penrose's resource-based theory of the firm? The leading scientist who became the owner of this company in 1870, he turned the company into a foundation, and in order to make sure that the foundation managers and the later managers for the next 100 years would implement his will, he wrote a foundation statute where he specified and laid down his management philosophy. And here's a guy who lays down the resource-based theory of the firm 80 years before it was done by academics in the West. And it's extremely interesting. And so I realized we can actually almost like make this available for the English-speaking audience, because very rarely are managers able to articulate very well what they're actually doing. They're very good at action doing, but very bad at articulating the principles. So the bottom line here is, sometimes a case turns out to be not useful for the question you had at hand, but you discover something else which is so interesting and so useful that you can actually repurpose the case. Okay. So I want to give you another example of a talking pig. So you can ask yourself, well, how do I make sure I have a counterintuitive case? I already gave you one. I want to give you one more. If you came to me and said, today one company in China is the most innovative company in all of world history, I say, let's talk. If this is true, this is so amazing, I can tell you, we can publish in top journal, if it's true. The reason why it's a talking pig is because most of us think that a lot of Chinese companies are copycats. Some companies may be catching up the frontier, but the idea that the most innovative company in all of world history is here right now in China, wow. I hope you're getting a little bit of the spirit of what it means to look for cases where the audience is really surprised by it, because then nobody will ask you, okay, show me 10,000 talking pigs before I want to look at one. Everyone will be willing to just have a case study of one and not think this is not science. Okay, here is the second example of how to be persuasive with case studies. Theories say that the case should not exist or they cannot explain it. So when you can find a case which is not predicted by a theory, that's very good. And I'm going to tell you about a case that I'm presently working on. I have not finished it. I have not even published anything. I'm just in the process of doing the case. This is Wesfarmers, an Australian company which is now the biggest company in Australia. For those of you who are teachers in strategic management, you will know that we are all teaching our MBAs in corporate strategy. A little bit of diversification is good. You increase on average the performance of companies. If you become widely diversified in many different sectors, on average, performance goes down compared to more narrowly diversified companies. This is being taught everywhere across the entire world to MBA students. The beauty is, Wesfarmers is a widely diversified company, doing everything from supermarkets to insurance, to industrialization, coal mining, chemicals, energy, a wide variety of unrelated sectors. And it turns out that Wesfarmers, if you had bought stocks in Wesfarmers in 1984 when it became a public company and until now, Wesfarmers is the best performing company in Australia on the stock market. I gave a presentation on Wesfarmers a couple of weeks ago. I will give one here on Tuesday at Nanjing University. I gave it in Italy 5 weeks ago in front of strategy professors. Everyone in the room wanted to know, how can that be so? Because theory clearly does not predict this. So we need to understand what is going on here, and that's another way to justify a case study. Okay, and the third way to justify a case study is by basically articulating, it sheds light on a phenomenon that no one has studied before in that detail. And I want to give you an example of my paper that I published in 2013. When I was a doctoral student, a lot of people started to use the idea of coevolution in order to frame the theories of their papers. And here I put a long list of articles that had written about coevolution. And when I tried to justify my paper, I said, well, how am I going to make a contribution to the literature? It turned out that people really had not studied the microcausal processes in coevolution. They all had said there is coevolution, but nobody had looked at the details. So let me give you some example of this. And I know this is very fast. Basically, evolutionary theory, as a very abstract theory, has three component processes: variation, selection, and retention. So in terms of industry, is entrepreneurs or firm members develop new action plans, introduce them. Selection, profitable firms grow. Unprofitable firms die and are weeded out. And then organizational blueprints in terms of processes, routines are stored in the company, and those companies which do well grow over time, and the other companies go out. I'm not going to go into details. I just want to show you is that what I did was I said there was no study which actually looked at variation, selection, retention in the industry level and in academia, and then actually showed how did this coevolution change variation in one domain or another, or change retention. So basically I zoomed in, and I'm going to give you one example that basically I could show that one mechanism of coevolution is commercial ties. And an example of this, professor gives only one or two firms access to his or her students' innovations. And from the point of view of the firms provide professors with expensive chemicals for their laboratory. So that was coevolution in chemicals. And my contribution here was very specific. I say commercial ties influence variation and selection across the two domains, but do not influence retention. In the paper, I do much more of that, but I was very, very precise. What is my theoretical contribution here? And I could claim, because I had read the literature, no one else has done this before. And that is why you should publish me in the top journal. Okay, I have another 20 minutes or so, 19 minutes precise. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you 4 other examples of great case studies and try to explain to you why they're great case studies. Now, the organizer of the conference was so nice, they actually put the Chinese translation of the abstract of these papers there. And I strongly encourage you, if you're working in similar domains, means macro OT and strategy, take a look at these papers because they're really, really great role models. I'm going to talk about these 4 examples. One is by Mirabeau and McGuire, a recent article that appeared in SMJ. I just came across it a month ago, and I think it is absolutely fantastic. The second one is also one of my all-time favorites by Daniels, trying to become a different typewriter company, dynamic capabilities at Smith Corona, a strategic management journal. And then I'm coming back to Nikolai Sikelkov. He wrote a great paper on the evolution towards fit in Administrative Science Quarterly. And then I will talk about Miller et al., innovation in complex systems in industrial corporate change. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you my take on why I think these papers are so good and why they made it into the top journals. What are some of the key features? Number one, they do an amazingly beautiful job in the first 4 pages reviewing the entire literature on process strategies. And you read to say, wow, this is beautifully done. And then reviewing the entire literature, they are very precise in saying what is lacking in the literature and what is the gap. So they say, I'm quoting, in sum, the literature is unambiguous in its evidence of emergent strategy, but contains surprisingly little about its formulation. So what they're saying is, in the field of strategy, there was the big view, good strategy is top-down. The CEO, top management team decides, and then it pushes strategy down. Henry Mintzberg said, no, good strategy actually emerges in a different way. Often it emerges from bottom up, then top managers see what works, and then say, yes, that's the strategy, and now let's roll this out consistently. And here the guy's saying, yes, we all know that emergent strategies are very important. But actually, people have done studies, why is this emergent strategy emerging and not another one? So we have not seen the details of why certain strategies emerge rather than others. And that's our contribution. As a reader, you can say, well, yeah, I want to know about this. I want to hear this. And then they articulate 2 very, very precise questions, which guides the entire study. How does emergent strategy from autonomous strategic behavior, form from autonomous strategic behavior organizations? And second, besides practice of allocating material resources, which strategy practices are involved in this transition and what role they play? So let me translate this for you a little bit. Bauer from Harvard Business School had already shown that the resource allocation process is very, very important in deciding what strategies work. So he said, we know this. Let's now look at, aside from the resource allocation process, what other processes are really, really decisive in selecting which strategies make it up and which not? You could have not made this research question if you didn't have a deep understanding of the existing literature on strategy process. If you had not mastered it, and if you could articulate what the gap is, then you can articulate a research question where you know it has a high likelihood of making a contribution. Notice, this could have been done before you do any empirical work on your case, right? This is just knowing the literature and being able to specify what is missing. And once you articulate those questions, it also then forces you into certain research designs. Since they are talking about the emergence of strategy, you cannot have a one-time slice shot, only look at a company at one time. You need to have a longitudinal study. So the research question then forces you into design, and oftentimes people have a research question that forces them to longitudinal data, and then they present to us one time slot. And I said, look, your data can never answer the question. They are also excellent because the wealth of data that they have is mind-boggling. They did 2 years worth of field work. They had access to all the company documents for the strategy. They had all the PowerPoint slides where even middle managers go up to other groups and make a presentation about a new initiative. They could content analyze all of these PowerPoint slides and documents. On top, they had 30 semi-structured interviews. And then they had access to 2,000 emails. Emails is a real benefit for us researchers because it leaves traces of what is happening in a company that is much better often than the recollection of individuals. We forget what really happened 10 years later because we reinterpret the past based on what happened later on. But email records in real time, that is a statement of what the person believed at the time. So I also encourage you to think about it. Can you use email correspondence or WeChat, little messages being sent back and forth between managers? And then what they do is they basically have then very concrete findings. In addition to the resource allocation process, they articulate 3 clear processes that help certain strategies to become the winners. One is mobilizing wider support for the impetus. So you're almost like a social movement. You have to get other people in company, lower levels, to be excited, and you've got to build a social movement and show how they do that. Then you've got to manipulate the strategic context for confidence. So they find oftentimes a new initiative is completely inconsistent with what top management has said. So you need to strategically manipulate how you frame your proposal, and you need the top management to say, let's just reframe what we want in the first place. Now, I understand China is very good at this, right? But in the West, it's a bit surprising. And finally, altering the structural context for embeddedness. So basically, they alter who is being put on the board. My goal here is not to give you a great detail on the article. I just wanted to tell you is, at the end, they come up with 3 processes that help select emergent strategies. And my big point here is, at these 3 processes, we as a reader believe, yes, in principle, this could apply to other companies. We don't believe that this is so specific to this company that we don't believe it could be true more widely. If you have a case study and your reader feels, look, this is about a Nanjing company at a specific point in time with particular managers, and this situation will never occur again, then that is not publishable because it cannot be generalizable at all. That doesn't mean that you have to do either study other case studies before you generalize, but in principle, the findings have to be generalizable to more cases than one. It doesn't have to be to the entire world, but more cases than one. Okay, here is the paper by Daniels. And again, if you read this, you are blown away by the level of detailed data this gentleman has put together. What he does in the beginning is, again, he articulates a very clear contribution to the theoretical literature on dynamic capabilities. For those of you in strategy, you know dynamic capabilities is a big, big topic, right? So it's a lot easier to publish a case study on a hot topic that a lot of people are interested in, because your likelihood of finding a reviewer that really wants to get a deeper insight is higher than a topic that people have left behind. So for instance, contingency theory. Right now, not many people are so interested in contingency theory. And if you say I have a case study on contingency theory, that's a lot harder to publish than one on dynamic capabilities. And again, it's very clear in the contribution. This study highlights resource cognition as a missing element in dynamic capability theory. So basically what he's saying here is, there are not just resources out there. The way managers conceptualize what these resources mean has an independent causal role in whether or not the firm can adapt to its changing environment. And then the paper shows something that I believe no one has shown before. At least I had not seen it. So one of the reasons why I personally like the paper so much is the following. I'm going to use a little illustration of this here. So in the field of management, there are two big rival explanations for why we see the economy growing, why firms are so good. Okay? One big theory, and often in business schools, we teach this theory. We teach to our students. I call it the theory, come to me, pay me some money, and you will be the best manager and beat competition. Basically, this theory is the theory of adaptation, which sees the following. The companies which adapt over time, the explanation for their adaptation is because they had a superstar manager. So here in the Chinese context, it would be the CEO of Alibaba, right? The CEO of Alibaba, whatever comes, new technology, new government, he will manage it and adapt the firm and it will be good. So here's an illustration from my work. Here companies, one company, a standard firm doing no R&D, another company doing a little bit of informal R&D, and company doing formal R&D. Alibaba, for instance, is not doing formal R&D. And let's say in time T2, companies which formal R&D clearly are more innovative and are more competitive, so they kill everyone. So in the heroic theory of management, every success firm sees the blue firm says, okay, we will of course continue doing blue, and the green firm says we will also become blue because that's the way to succeed. So you explain the adaptation of firms by looking at the CEO and saying the CEO was so clever and so good and that's why they adapted. Okay, that's theory number one. Theory number two, actually it says you don't need to have intelligent managers at all. Just have a lot of firms that start into the market. Some will do the right thing, and those who do the right thing will grow, and those who don't do the right thing, they die. And you can get perfect adaptation through that. And this is the selection, this population-level argument. So here we again have a population of firms, not a lot of firms competing, and now we have a selection filter, which means selection, blue firms are more easily going into the future. They survive because they make money. Green firms will be selected and yellow firms get through. So over time, this population becomes more blue and more yellow, not because people are so clever, but simply because the selection process weeds out the green firms and adapts the population because of the selection process. Now this is very technical, but I want to show you the big contribution for Daniel and what I thought was so good. Daniel shows in the evolutionary perspective, we say the firms cannot change. They are inert. Okay? They don't change. And Daniel shows for a typewriter company, in the time of computers and word processors, he showed how amazingly they tried to change. They tried many, many, many things. So basically he shows, no, actually they try to become blue firms. Very hard. They try many things, but they still fail. So he had shown for the first time just how hard an individual firm tried to adapt by even trying to invent a computer. They had a computer. They had a semi-electric typewriter. They had a big R&D. So this was amazing because no one had shown that data before. And I tried to give you a little bit of a feeling for why this is interesting, because it basically is a contribution to, on the one hand, clearly firms are not completely inert, but it also still shows that adaptation is very, very difficult. Okay, I have 4 minutes, and I want to quickly spend a little bit of time why the Sikholkov paper is important. Now again, he is making a contribution to a long-standing literature on core and peripheral organization elements and how they change over time, also on organization fit. So again, he's working with important literature. Secondly, he studies one firm, Vanguard, over 20 years, and he systematically looks at how core and peripheral organizational elements change over time. And then he comes up with first, in terms of data, he first read all of the archival data. It turned out that CEO also left a lot of public statements about why he was doing what he was doing. So there was a lot of management philosophy. He interviewed middle-level managers, and then he interviewed the CEO as he was doing the research in order to refine his understanding of really what went on. Then he developed a new methodology for deciding what organization elements are core and peripheral. You can see how important that is, right? If you want to make a study of this, you need to find an empirical methodology for deciding, is this a core or a peripheral element? And he invented that methodology. And then he developed out of this case study inductively an abstract typology of 4 processes characterizing how core elements subsequently change. So again, the bottom line here is big, important literature on organization design. People have not studied how core and peripheral elements change over time. The only way to do this is to zoom into one company and do it systematically. He collects systematic data over 20 years. And then most of these good case studies do is they also find a very nice way to represent in a picture core arguments. And I'm not going to go through the details of this, but all of the examples that I showed you typically have fantastic pictures that basically summarize the core idea in the graph. And I finally want to talk about Miller and Al. Why is this an amazing study? First of all, again, you read this study and you realize the researchers have a deep, deep understanding of the industry. This is not superficially done one afternoon, let me talk to a company and let me draw some conclusions from this. And they convincingly showed that theories developed for large-scale manufacturing industries, for example, automobiles, tires, do not explain the pattern of evolution of large-scale customized products like flight simulator industries. So basically they showed we all believe there's a general pattern of industry evolution, but then they showed us a case which does not conform and correspond to that pattern. And they're also very, very clear that they are not making a claim that by having studied this flight simulator industry, they have shown that this would apply to all customized large-scale products. They just, again, say, this could. So in principle, it is generalizable. Okay, very quickly, so here's the pattern of industry evolution. Typically, automobiles, a large number of firms come in, and then after 10 years, there's a shakeout and firms die. And basically what these guys have shown is, no, at the level of the systems integrator, from one generation to the next, it's the same firms. There's no death of firms, no new firms come in. The turnover happened at the level of first-year suppliers. So the patterns that we have shown in most industries doesn't work here, and they have very detailed data again to show this. And I read this entire literature, and I said to myself, wow, this is amazing. I wish I could do a study like this because it is absolutely amazing. Okay, some concluding thoughts. In management research, it is difficult to find a case that is truly as amazing as a talking pig, but it's always useful to look for one. So ask yourself, is this study going to be counterintuitive? If anyone expects everything you're going to find, look for another case. Secondly, but all of the case examples we reviewed, they were very good at identifying a theoretical gap in the literature. You need to have that in order to persuade readers that we should look at one case and give up the benefit of having multiple cases. They were able to make a clear contribution to developing new theoretical ideas. They all had very detailed empirical understanding of their case. Read them and you say, you're blown away how much they knew about their city. And they all offered some data that had never been presented before in that detail. That is how you persuade your audience. We should look at one case or a few cases rather than run regression equations and see more scientific because we have a large N. So I hope this was useful for you. I'm very happy to make these slides available later on for you so you can look at some of the citations, some of the links, and you can hopefully read those papers and be inspired by them.